This is the Ministry of Truth. I'm Gordon Comstock, and let's get back into the history of the great American fortunes by Gustavus Myers. This here is Chapter 5 of Volume 4, The Blair and the Garrett Fortunes. Of John I. Blair, little is now heard, yet when he died in 1899 at the age of 97, he left a great personal fortune, estimated variously at from $60 million to $90 million. His wealth, descending largely to his son, DeWitt C. Blair, forms one of the notable estates in the United States. Here, according to the purveyors of public opinion, was an honest man. Here, incontestably, was a capitalist of, quote, rare business instinct, unquote, whose fortune came from pure, legitimate, and upright methods. Said one newspaper editorial at his death, quote, for more than half a century, he has been one of the leading businessmen in the country, and for more than a quarter of a century, one of the richest men in the world, his fortune being estimated at from $50 million to $100 million, every farthing of which came to him through legitimate channels, creating other wealth on its way to him. For there's the old lie, another one, as well as after it had reached his hands, unquote. This was not an isolated eulogy. Round and round the columns of the press went these paeans, with never a dissent or demurring. An inquiry into Blair's career. Okay, Gustavus, tell us the real deal here with this Blair guy. Leave it to Gus. He'll give us the straight dope. Through all of these weary pages have we searched afar with infinitesimal scrutiny for a fortune acquired by honest means. Nor have the methods been measured by the test of a code of advanced ethics, but solely by the laws as they stood in the respective times. At no time has the discovery of an quote-unquote honest fortune rewarded our determined quest. Often we thought that we had come across a specimen only to find distressing disappointment. Through all fortunes, large and small, runs the heavy streak of fraud and theft. The little trader, with his misrepresentation and swindling, differing from the great frauds in degree only. Have we at last, in Blair's, stumbled upon one fortune unblemished by any taint whatsoever? Can we now exclaim, Eureka? So it would seem, if current comment is to be swallowed as the fact. But inasmuch as we have doggedly developed in exploring, if not a perversely skeptical turn of mind, let us gratify it to the full by investigating the career of this paragon of commercial virtue. Now, it does so happen that whatever the reserved, sequestered life Blair led in his dotage, basking in the titular glory of wonderful businessman and philanthropist, he left a large, resounding impress upon industrial events of 50 and 60 years ago. The surviving records, buried in obscurity, emerge from their forgotten shelves to confound the fairy tales of present-day eulogists. He was contemporaneous with Commodore Vanderbilt, the first John Jacob Astor, and Russell Sage, and he was as excellent a businessman as any of them, which is to say, His methods were relatively the same as theirs. While Astor was proving his talent as a successful businessman by debauching, swindling, and murdering Indian tribes, and while Vanderbilt was blackmailing, and Sage was bribing and embezzling, Blair was demonstrating in his own way that he too had all the necessary qualifications of, quote, a leading businessman, unquote. Born near Belvidere, New Jersey in 1802, his parents were farming folk, and his biographers relate with a blissful smack of appreciation that when he was a very young boy, he announced to his mother that, quote, I could go in for education, but I intend to get rich, unquote. Like Sage, he started as a clerk in a country store, and he then widened into being the owner of a general merchandise store at what is now Blairstown, New Jersey. Years passed, and he prospered, his panegyrists tell, and then he opened a number of branch stores. But this part of his career is shrouded in mere tradition. Nothing authentic is known of his methods at the time. Blair as a railroad builder. Blair next turned up as the owner of an iron foundry at Oxford Furnace, New Jersey, and it is from this point of his career that definite facts are embodied in official records. Says one biographer, the necessity for transporting the metal to the seaboard led Mr. Blair and others to organize the Lackawanna Coal and Iron Company, out of which has grown the great system of the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad, unquote. With this all-inclusive sentence, the biographer airily dismisses this part of the subject. But there are weighty reasons why we should dwell upon it, with brief yet sufficient explanation. For it was in this operation that Blair made his first millions. It was here that he gave his first scintillating demonstrations of his, quote, rare business instincts, unquote. Had it not been for an acrimonious falling out between him and his associates in this railroad business, the truth would be beyond reach. As it is, these men made the huge error of perpetuating their quarrel in print. An unpardonable blunder if the good opinion of posterity is to be held. This quarrel arose over such a sordid matter as the allotment of graft. It was a bitter, ungentlemanly row, as is all too clearly evidenced in the biting denunciations of one another that were put in the reports by the disputants themselves. From these reports it appears that Blair was, indeed, doing business in the accustomed style. He was selling, at excessive prices, the products of his mill to a railroad corporation of which he was a director, and individually building branch lines which he foisted at enormous profit upon the corporation. The Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad, now one of the very richest in the land, was organized in 1850 by the grouping of a number of small separate lines. To secure franchises and special rights and aid, the usual procedure of bribery was resorted to, and with unfailing success. The men at the head of it knew their slippery trade well. They were the same rich merchants who were involved in many another fraud. Some of them we have accosted before in these chapters: George D. Phelps, John J. Phelps, William E. Dodge, Moses Taylor, and others. With John I. Blair, these men formed the board of directors of the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad Company. One of the separate lines incorporated in this railroad was the Warren Line, crossing New Jersey into Pennsylvania. The building of this road, as nearly as can be made out from the law records, was attended with some very peculiar circumstances. Two sets of capitalists were competing for a franchise to extend their railroads through the mountains to the Delaware Water Gap. One was the Morris and Essex Railroad Company, the other the Warren Railroad Company, headed by Blair and Dodge. Both, in 1851, obtained charters from the New Jersey legislature within a few days of each other's grant. In those years, scandal after scandal was developed in successive New Jersey legislatures. It was no secret that the railroad magnates not only debauched the legislature and the common councils of the cities with bribes, but regularly, in true business-like style, corrupted the elections of the state. In 1851, for instance, the only candidates balloted for by the legislature for the post of United States Senator were rival railroad nabobs, the very same men who, it was notorious, had for years been bribing and corrupting. Which of the two sets would succeed in building its railroad extension first? The legislature had accommodated both with charters for the same route. In that respect, they were on an equal footing. But Blair and Dodge completely outwitted the Morris and Essex set, and went on to claim prior rights for their lines. The Morris and Essex Railroad Company charged fraud and went hot-footed into court after an injunction which temporarily it obtained. The case came up for final adjudication in the New Jersey Court of Chancery in 1854. The Morris and Essex group asserted that they had bought the right-of-way through the Van Ness Gap and charged Blair with taking fraudulent possession of these lands for the purpose of, quote, fraudulently frustrating the complainants in the extension of their road, unquote. That the survey made by Blair and Dodge was fraudulent, and that there were other frauds. In his answer, Blair put in a general denial, although he admitted that the Morris and Essex Railroad Company had bought the land and received deeds for it, but averred that this took place after the lands had been conveyed to the Warren Railroad Company. Each side charged the other with fraud. Undoubtedly, the assertions of both were correct. Oh, this is great. Judge Green decided in favor of Blair and dissolved the injunction. Subsequently, the Warren Railroad was uploaded upon the DL&W at a great profit. Charges of jobbery and grafting. At first, the relations among Blair, the Phelpses, and Dodge must have been of that brotherly unity springing from the satisfactory apportioning of good things. Previous to 1856, the annual reports of the Board of Managers of the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad Company breathed the most splendid harmony with never a ripple of discord. As president of the company, Phelps had appointed Blair the land agent for the Warren division of the railroad. Very evidently, a joyous, comfortable spirit of satisfaction with the way things were progressing, pervaded this stalwart group of worthies. Suddenly, the tenor of their private and public communications changed. Peppery statements, growing into broadsides, were issued, filled with charges and countercharges, and a caustic quarrel set in over the question of graft, especially in connection with the Warren Railroad. On September 9, 1856, Phelps resigned from the presidency, and in doing so, practically charged others of the directors with carrying on a profuse system of grafting in the purchase of land, supplies, and branch lines. Did Phelps resign as a protest? More probably, the actual situation was that the internal fight sprang up over difficulty in adjusting the division of the spoils, and the anti-Phelps faction had proved itself the stronger. Phelps set forth his case in published confidential statements accompanying the annual reports. He boasted that after the franchises of the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad had been forfeited for non-compliance, that it was he who had got through an act on April 2, 1885, quote, restoring all franchises and granting other important privileges, unquote. He complained of the exorbitant expenditures the directors were making, and significantly pointing out that when he wanted to get an auditor, Blair and other directors refused to vote for one. Referring to the process of graft, Phelps wrote that, quote, one of our managers, Blair, is a director and large stockholder in the Lackawanna Iron and Coal Company, 1/8 owner in the Lehigh and Tobiana Land Company, largely interested in real estate along the line of the road, and president of the Warren Railroad, of which his son is a principal contractor. Another son is director and very large owner in the Lackawanna Iron and Coal Company, unquote, etc. In another confidential circular dated January 17, 1857, Phelps criticized Blair as, quote, one of the parties more particularly referred to, unquote, and as, quote, systematically opposed to my measures, unquote. If this much came out in cold type, what must have been the whole story? The fragmentary visions we get in these reports are undoubtedly but an index to the elaborate miscellanies of graft carried on by Blair in every available direction. Blair's railroads in the West. Blair's loot in these transactions appears to have been very large. His operations were so successful that he went into railroad founding as a regular pursuit. And, as did Sage, he combined professional politics and business. His greatest opportunities came when the Union Pacific and other railroad charters, subsidies, and land grants were bribed through Congress. Wrote one of his puffers, quote, in the early days of the settlement of the Great West, Mr. Blair found ample opportunity for the exercise of his rare judgment and untiring energy, and his name was connected, either as a builder or director, with not less than 25 different lines, unquote. Sounds like somebody writing about a king, some groveling servant of a king, doesn't it? That's what these financial oligarchs really are. They are really the kings of this monopolistic system that we call America. What a symmetrical and appealing description. All that it lacks to complete it are certain trivial details, which will here be supplied. As one of the original directors of the Union Pacific Railroad, Blair shared in its continuous and stupendous frauds. But it was in Iowa that he plundered the most of his tens of millions. Iowa, with its fine, pristine agricultural lands, among the richest in the United States, while Sage was busily engaged in thefts and expropriations in Wisconsin and Minnesota, he was also, as was Blair, pursuing precisely the same methods in Iowa. There was the same bribery of Congress and of legislature, the same story of immense subsidies and land grants corruptly secured, the same outcome of thieving construction companies, looted railroads, the cheating of investors, bankruptcies, and fraudulent receiverships. Not less than $50 million in subsidies, in one form or another, were obtained by the railway companies in Iowa. Their land grants reached almost 5 million acres. In the projection of the railroads in that state, Blair was the predominating, almost excepting Sage, the exclusive figure. He seemed to direct everything, and he certainly allowed no one else to pocket what he could get away with himself. The Sioux City and Pacific frauds. One of a number of his railroads was the Sioux City and Pacific, a line with a very ambitious name, but of modest length. Its charter, subsidies, and land grant were obtained by Blair at the auspicious and precise time when the Union Pacific measures were passed by bribery. Whether, however, Blair used money in corrupting Congress is not to be determined from the official records. But if he did not, he, at any rate, employed an even more subtle and effective mode of corruption. The congressional investigations reveal that it was his system to debauch members of Congress with gifts of stock in his corporations. These honorable members, of course, mightily protested that they had paid for it, but nobody believed their excuses. Poor's Railroad Manual for 1872-1873 additionally reveals that among the directors and stockholders of Blair's railroads were some of the identical members of Congress, both of the House and Senate, who had advocated and voted for the charters, subsidies, and land grants for these railroads. For the Sioux City and Pacific Railroad, Blair secured a land grant of 100 sections and $16,000 of government bonds for each mile of railroad. What happened next? Act 2 was the organization of a construction company modeled on exactly the same lines as the Credit Mobilier. As the head of this company, Blair extorted large sums for building the railroad. On the prairies of Iowa, with almost no grading necessary, railroad building called for comparatively little expenditure. Expert testimony before the Pacific Railroad Commission in 1877 estimated that the road could have been built at a cost of $2,600,000, with the supplementary statement, parentheses, and what a commentary it formed upon the business standards of the times, end parentheses, that if honestly done, the entire cost ought not to have exceeded $1 million. A little item of a $4 million theft. What did Blair's company, which was mainly himself and his sons, charge? It awarded itself $49,865 a mile, or a total of more than $5 million. Then, having bled the railroad into insolvency, Blair enriched himself further by selling it to the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad Company. If there be any doubt of the cool deliberation with which those, quote, eminent capitalists, unquote, set out to swindle the government, it must perforce be dissipated by consideration of the following fact. Quote, when the negotiations were pending for the transfer of the stock of the Sioux City and Pacific Railroad Company to the Chicago and Northwestern, unquote, reads the report of the Pacific Railroad Commission, quote, John I. Blair offered a resolution which appears on the minutes, setting forth that the Chicago and Northwestern must bind itself to protect every obligation of the company except that to the United States government, unquote. This was a refreshingly candid way of arranging swindles in advance. And, in fact, the final swindle of the government of much of the funds that it had advanced was accomplished in 1900. By an act then lobbied through Congress, the company was virtually released from paying back more than 1/10 of the sum it still owed the government. Another railroad plundered. But Blair's frauds in the inception and construction of the Sioux City and Pacific, and some of his other roads, were surpassed, in degree at least, by those he put through in another of his Iowa railroad projects, the Dubuque and Sioux City line. The charter and land grants of this railroad and those of the Iowa Falls and Sioux City Railroad were given by an act passed by Congress on May 15, 1856. We have seen what indiscriminate corruption was going on in Congress in 1856 and accompanying years. How the Des Moines River and Navigation Company's land grant was obtained by bribery, and how committees were reporting the existence of corrupt combinations in Congress. There is no definite official evidence that the charter and land grants of the Dubuque and Sioux City Railroad Company and those of the Iowa Falls and Sioux City were secured by bribery. But judging by the collateral circumstances attending the passage of other bills at the same time, the probabilities are strong that they were. By the Act of 1856, these two companies received as a gift about 1,200,000 acres of public land in Iowa. Despite this lavish present, the incorporators made little or no attempt to build the entire railroad. They occupied themselves almost solely with stock jobbing and with the business of profitably disposing of the land to settlers. Congress was compelled under public pressure to forfeit much of their land grant. Okay, we're going to take a break right here. You will hear from me in a couple of minutes. We are back. This is the Ministry of Truth. I'm Gordon Comstock, and we're about halfway through Chapter 5 of Volume 4 of the History of the Great American Fortunes by Gustavus Myers. Corrupting of Congress. Blair saw what glorious opportunities had been lost by the act of forfeiture, but the mischief could be undone. If one set of capitalists were obtuse enough not to know how a restoration could be brought about, he knew. So he came forward, took up the companies as his own, and applied to Congress and to the legislature of Iowa for a resumption of the rights and grants of which they had been shorn. He succeeded. Both Congress and the Iowa legislature passed acts in 1868 restoring the rights and land grants. How came it that he encountered no obstacles in his plan? Why were these legislative bodies so tractable? Of course, they could plead that they simply acted in deference to memorials from the citizens of Iowa. But memorials were transparent affairs easily manufactured, and the quote-unquote Wilson Committee, i.e. the Credit Mobilier investigation of 1872, could make its whitewashing report that, quote, no evidence could be found, unquote, of money having been used for, quote, improper purposes, unquote, either in Congress or in the Iowa legislature. But the testimony before this very committee flatly contradicted its conclusions. It was revealed that a whole string of conspicuous members of Congress had suddenly become large stockholders in the Dubuque and Sioux City Railroad. Upon getting the restoration of the land grant, Blair organized a construction company called the Sioux City Railroad Contracting Company, and by the usual cumulative system of frauds in construction work, made immense quote-unquote profits, reaching many millions of dollars. Some of the railroads that Blair plundered are now parts of the Illinois Central System, of which Harriman became dictator. It must not be thought, however, that outright bribery was always resorted to in order to secure subsidies, special rights, and immunities. In the first stages of railroad history, direct bribery was the usual means, but as time wore on, the passing of money in direct forms became less frequent, and a less crude, finer and more insidious system of bribery was generally substituted. The Western magnates began to follow the advice of that Eastern magnate who declared that it was easier to elect than to buy a legislature. Bribery by money and otherwise. The newer system, as it was carried on in Iowa and other states, was succinctly described in 1895 by William Larrabee, erstwhile governor of Iowa. He wrote, with a long and keen knowledge of the facts, quote, outright bribery is probably the means least often employed by corporations to carry their measures. It is the policy of the political corruption committees of corporations to ascertain the weaknesses and wants of every man whose services they are likely to need, and to attack him if his surrender should be essential to their victory at his weakest point. Sounds like he's describing Satan. Men with political ambition are encouraged to aspire to preferment and are assured of corporate support to bring it about. Briefless lawyers are promised corporate business or salaried attorneyships. Those in financial straits are accommodated with loans. Vain men are flattered and given newspaper notoriety. Others are given passes for their families and their friends. Shippers are given advantages in rates over their competitors. The idea is that every legislator shall receive for his vote and influence some compensation which combines the maximum of desirability to him with the minimum of violence to his self-respect. The lobby which represents the railroad companies at legislative sessions is usually the largest, the most sagacious, and the most unscrupulous of all. In extreme cases, influential constituents of doubtful members are sent for at the largest moment to labor with their representatives and to assure them that the sentiment of their districts is in favor of the measure advocated by the railroads. Telegrams pour in upon the unsuspecting members. Petitions in favor of the proposed measure are also hastily circulated among the more unsophisticated constituents of members sensitive to public opinion, and are then presented to them as an unmistakable indication of the popular will. Another powerful reinforcement of the railroad lobby is not infrequently a subsidized press and its correspondence, unquote. But the robbery by means of construction companies in his numerous railroad projects formed only a part of the wealth grasped by Blair. 1/8 of the entire domain of the richly fertile state of Iowa was granted to railroads, most of which Blair owned. This reached an area almost as large as the state of Massachusetts. Settlers were compelled to pay an exorbitant price for farmlands, and very often were under mortgage to the railroad companies. A detailed description of Blair's methods would be simply a repetition of those described in previous chapters in the case of other magnates. Philanthropy compared with fact. Although incurably stingy in personal expenditures, the meanest of men, Blair donated just enough money to procure the award of being an extremely pious philanthropist. He founded 100 churches in the West. He established a Presbyterian academy at a cost of $150,000 and gave several $100,000 more to the Presbyterian Church. But what were the effects of his frauds and oppressions, and those of his successors, upon the very people to whom he so devoutly contributed pulpits and gospels? Writing of the Iowa railroads, Dr. Frank H. Dixon, a conservative writer, says, quote, "The roads had it in their power to make and unmake cities, to destroy the businesses of individuals, or to force their removal to favored points. The people were quickly up in arms against this policy. The flame of opposition was fanned by the bitter feelings aroused through absentee ownerships, so prevalent in the western states at this time. A well-settled conviction possessed the people that the owners of capital, directing their operations in absentia and through intermediaries, limited their interest in Western affairs to the amount of dividends which they could squeeze from the shippers," unquote. And, of course, the large amounts of watered stock upon which these dividends had to be paid were issued to cover the gigantic frauds of the railroad constructors and of succeeding groups of manipulators. This, in outline, was the course of Blair, so eminent and exalted a capitalist? Here is an elucidation of the fine textures of his, quote, rare business instincts, unquote. And knowing it, the mystery of where his 60 or 90 millions came from is quite apparent, if not entirely clear. What Blair and others were doing in the North and West before, during, and after the Civil War, John W. Garrett and Johns Hopkins were doing in Maryland. Scarcely referred to now, Garrett was extolled in his day as a, quote, famous railroad king, unquote. And in this case, it is not the man so much, nor the Garrett fortune which commands interest, as is the story of the railway line that he and Hopkins largely owned. This property forms today one of the great transportation systems of the country. The Baltimore and Ohio, built by public money. As were other railroads, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad was built almost wholly with funds granted by state, counties, and municipalities. In 1827, the state of Maryland granted a subscription of $500,000 as first aid, and the city of Baltimore the same sum. At the outset, the projectors loftily disclaimed any intention of asking any further grants of public aid. Private capital, said they, would construct the road. But 7 years later, they made another inroad upon the public treasury. The state of Maryland was induced to subscribe $3 million more in 1835, and the city of Baltimore $3 million in 1836. In 1838, they obtained $1 million from the city of Wheeling. For a while, they were discreet enough to refrain from again attacking the public treasury. But when, in 1850, they applied to the Common Council of Baltimore for $5 million more and obtained the amount, there was some questioning as to what had become of the many millions contributed from the public exchequer. A considerable part, it was evident, had been used in constructing the railroad, but opinions were freely expressed that the directors had been enriching themselves by the customary grafting devices of the day, such as, for instance, those used by Blair in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and New York. Whenever, however, opposition to additional appropriations sprang up and embarrassing questions were asked, the directors would have their glittering arguments ready. Quote, "See what a great work we have been carrying on. Is this not an enterprise of the greatest importance to the whole community, to the farmer, to the mechanic, and to the businessman? Now, when we are on the high road to completion, shall we have to suspend because of lack of funds? Would not this be a great public calamity?" Unquote. Sounds like the character Squealer from Animal Farm, rationalizing everything and threatening the public with suspension of actions unless they cough up more money. Such arguments told with the public, and the legislatures and common councils, corruptly influenced, could always base their explanations upon them. Garrett and Hopkins get control. Plundered by the original clique, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad went into financial ruin. Notwithstanding the great bounties that it had received, it was in a demoralized condition in 1856, and its treasury was empty. Garrett and Hopkins, who had long been associated with it and who had probably shared in the loot, although there is no specific proof on this point, bought up more quantities of its stock, then selling cheap, and snatched control. Born in Baltimore in 1820, Garrett was the son of a rich shipping merchant. Hopkins had made money in the grocery business. Garrett and Hopkins not only continued the long prevailing frauds, but put through many other fraudulent and corrupt acts. Here, for example, is one of the smaller frauds. The millions of stock subscriptions donated by the state of Maryland for the building of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad had been to a large extent floated in London among British capitalists. The interest had to be paid by Maryland to these financiers in gold. Did the company, on its part, reimburse the state in coin? By no means. It claimed, by force of certain judicial decisions, that it was not required to pay interest to the state otherwise than in currency. Under the prevailing money conditions and estimating the difference in rates of exchange, this form of payment meant a constant loss to the state of Maryland, a loss reaching more than a total of $400,000, of which amount the Baltimore and Ohio cheated the state. Far greater were the amounts of which the state of Maryland was cheated in the fraudulent manipulation of what was called the Washington branch of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. In return for franchises and aid, the company agreed to pay the state 1/5 of the passenger receipts. After the branch was in successful operation, its treasury was constantly represented as so sickly that there was no money in hand with which to pay the state. Time after time, inquiries were made by honest legislators as to where the great profits had gone. No satisfactory answer was ever given. The state was absolutely cheated. And finally, a corrupt act was passed, practically abandoning all of the state's claims. Under Garrett and Hopkins' control, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Company caused a series of measures to be passed, exceeding in corruption, in some respects, those put through by Commodore Vanderbilt in New York. Repeatedly, the legislatures of Maryland, Virginia, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, and other states, and the common councils of many cities were bought up, and the courts were thoroughly subverted. Franchises of inestimable value were given away. The public treasury was cheated out of the sums advanced, and was drawn upon to pay the expense of improvements. Large stock watering issues were authorized, and the company was virtually relieved from taxation. By 1876, fully $88 million of its property went untaxed. The militant object of Garrett and Hopkins was the destruction of the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal as a competitor. As Commodore Vanderbilt in New York found the Erie Canal to be a competitor of his lines, so Garrett and Hopkins decided that they could not get a monopoly of transportation in Maryland until the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal had been extinguished as a competitor. The obstacles in their way were great, for the state of Maryland had expended many millions of public money in the construction of the canal and owned it, and the public was not disposed to see its usefulness impaired. This was especially true of the merchant class, which demanded competition and insisted that monopoly would be ruinous. Destroying canal competition. Beginning in 1860, Garrett and Hopkins corrupted the Maryland legislature until by one act piled upon another, they were gradually able to wrest away its ownership from the state. But they did not merely depend upon the bribing of legislators after they were in office. With money supplied by Garrett and Hopkins, the political bosses of Maryland engaged in packing of primaries, indiscriminate bribery of voters, and stuffing of ballot boxes. You could never trust your vote in this country, folks. Doesn't matter when, doesn't matter what election, doesn't matter now that they've got, it's not just the computer voting fraud thing that they have now. The vote in this country has always been subverted by the ruling class. Stuffing of ballot boxes, thus ensuring the election of subservient officials. Once the canal was practically in their hands, Garrett and Hopkins made it useless as a competitor. Having a complete monopoly, they now exacted extortionate rates for transportation, and they likewise increased their profits by cutting the pay of their employees. In desperation, the railroad workers declared a strike in 1877. False reports of the violence of the strikers were immediately broadcast. Using these charges as a pretext, the military was called out. Here we go again, calling out the military on Americans. It's a tradition as old as is this corporation we call a country. Goes all the way back to the Whiskey Rebellion under George Washington. We have a long tradition of calling out the military on we the little people. At Martinsburg, West Virginia, the state militia refused to fire upon the strikers. I add that because guys like Alex Jones will tell you that it's a new thing, a new threat. It's always been the case. This has always been the case in America, calling out the army on we the little people. At Martinsburg, West Virginia, the state militia refused to fire upon the strikers, but a company of militia, recruited from a class hostile to the strikers, there you go, opened fire, killing many of the strikers and wounding others. Hopkins becomes a philanthropist. Both Garrett and Hopkins extorted out large sums from their control and manipulations of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. Hopkins' fortune at his death amounted to nominally $10 million. At the time of his demise in 1873, he was, quote, the wealthiest citizen of Baltimore, unquote. The most close-fisted of men, he relaxed in at least one respect during the last year of his life. Following the example of so many other multimillionaires of the period, he made certain of the perpetuation of his memory as a quote-unquote great philanthropist. This is, oh wow, Johns Hopkins University. we hear this name and we're in awe of this. Must have been this great historical philanthropist in America. The guy was a crook who, as he was dying, apparently, thought he could buy his way into heaven, like all or most rich men do. Deathbed conversions. Let's see. To this end, in March 1873, he gave property valued at $4,500,000 with which to found a hospital in Baltimore. He presented Baltimore with a public park, and he donated $3,500,000 as an initial benefaction for the founding of the Johns Hopkins University. Here it is pertinent to inquire what was the form of property given in these bounties. Very largely, it consisted of Baltimore and Ohio Railroad stock. It was property representing the corruption of public life. Johns Hopkins University is founded upon corruption. The corruption of public life, the abasement of the workers, and the general spoliation of the entire community. And what was Garrett's share of the proceeds of the joint control? At his death in 1884, it was said to be $15 million, but it was undoubtedly much more. This wealth descended to his son Robert, who went through a series of personal excesses to wind up in melancholia and softening of the brain. Obviously enough, he was no match for those abler capitalists, the Vanderbilts, Goulds, and Scott. They pounced upon him and ruthlessly despoiled him as his father had despoiled others. His autocratic power and sway gradually vanished. When he died in 1896, his wealth had shrunk to about $5 million, and the Baltimore and Ohio system had passed under the control of the Pennsylvania Railroad group of magnates. It's like a feeding frenzy of sharks. All right, folks. That was Chapter 5 of Volume 4 of the History of the Great American Fortunes by Gustavus Myers from the very early 20th century. It's history you're not supposed to know about. And anyway, I'm Gordon Comstock. This has been the Ministry of Truth. This is the Ministry of Truth. I'm Gordon Comstock, and let's get back into the history of the Great American Fortunes by Gustavus Myers. This here is Chapter 5 of Volume 4, The Blair and the Garrett Fortunes. Of John I. Blair, little is now heard, yet when he died in 1899 at the age of 97, he left a great personal fortune, estimated variously at from $60 million to $90 million. His wealth, descending largely to his son, DeWitt C. Blair, forms one of the notable estates in the United States. Here, according to the purveyors of public opinion, was an honest man. Here, incontestably, was a capitalist of, quote, rare business instinct, unquote, whose fortune came from pure, legitimate, and upright methods. Said one newspaper editorial at his death, quote, for more than half a century, he has been one of the leading businessmen in the country, and for more than a quarter of a century, one of the richest men in the world. his fortune being estimated at from 50 million to 100 million. Large and small runs the heavy streak of fraud and theft. The little trader, with his misrepresentation and swindling, differing from the great frauds in degree only. Have we at last in Blair's stumbled upon one fortune unblemished by any taint whatsoever? Can we now exclaim, Eureka? So it would seem, if current comment is to be swallowed as the fact. But inasmuch as we have doggedly developed in exploring, if not a perversely skeptical turn of mind, let us gratify it to the full by investigating the career of this paragon of commercial virtue. Now, it does so happen that whatever the reserved, sequestered life Blair led in his dotage, basking in the titular glory of wonderful businessman and philanthropist, he left a large, resounding impress upon industrial events of 50 and 60 years ago. The surviving records, buried in obscurity, emerge from their forgotten shelves to confound the fairy tales of present-day eulogists. He was contemporaneous with Commodore Vanderbilt, the first John Jacob Astor, and Russell Sage, and he was as excellent a businessman as any of them, which is to say, his methods were relatively the same as theirs. While Astor was proving his talent as a successful businessman by debauching, swindling, and murdering Indian tribes, and while Vanderbilt was blackmailing, and Sage was bribing and embezzling, Blair was demonstrating in his own way that he too had all the necessary qualifications of, quote, a leading businessman, unquote. Born near Belvedere, New Jersey in 1802, his parents were farming folk, and his biographers relate with a blissful smack of appreciation that when he was a very young boy, he announced to his mother that, quote, I could go in for education, but I intend to get rich, unquote. Like Sage, he started as a clerk in a country store, and he then widened into being the owner of a general merchandise store at what is now Blairstown, New Jersey. Years passed, and he prospered, his panegyrists tell, and then he opened a number of branch stores. But this part of his career is shrouded in mere tradition. Nothing authentic is known of his methods at the time. Blair as a railroad builder. Blair next turned up as the owner of an iron foundry at Oxford Furnace, New Jersey, and it is from this point of his career that definite facts are embodied in official records. Says one biographer, the necessity for transporting the metal to the seaboard led Mr. Blair and others to organize the Lackawanna Coal and Iron Company, out of which has grown the great system of the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad, unquote. With this all-inclusive sentence, the biographer airily dismisses this part of the subject. But there are weighty reasons why we should dwell upon it. With brief, yet sufficient $1 million, every farthing of which came to him through legitimate channels, creating other wealth on its way to him. For there's the old lie, another one. As well as after it had reached his hands, unquote. This was not an isolated eulogy. Round and round the columns of the press went these paeans, with never a dissent or demurring. An inquiry into Blair's career. Okay, Gustavus, tell us the real deal here with this Blair guy. Leave it to Gus. He'll give us the straight dope. Through all of these weary pages have we searched afar with infinitesimal scrutiny for a fortune acquired by honest means. Nor have the methods been measured by the test of a code of advanced ethics, but solely by the laws as they stood in the respective times. At no time has the discovery of an quote-unquote honest fortune rewarded our determined quest. Often we thought that we had come across a specimen only to find distressing disappointment. Through all fortune